Signals drifted across cold interstellar channels, faint, cracked, and nearly swallowed by static, carrying the stubborn rhythm of a colony that refused to fall silent. The world had once been a modest trading junction, ordinary enough to be ignored by empires that measured worth and profit, yet when disaster fractured its skyways and stripped its grids, no council vessel altered course. Committees spoke in polished language, declaring the losses regrettable but acceptable, and the message echoed like a door closing. Families rationed filters and heat, recorded logs for children who might never hear them, and marked the passing of days by the dimming of emergency lights. Pride endured, but hope thinned to a fragile filament. Not one request for aid returned with promise. Every channel answered with silence dressed as procedure. The final transmission was quiet, spoken without accusation, only weary truth. Anyone still listening, we are alive. Far beyond the trade lanes, a Terran monitoring array caught the signal and held it like breath. Analysts replayed the broken syllables, mapping damage, counting hours, recognizing resolve embedded in every clipped word. No debate followed. The room grew still, and the decision formed with the weight of instinct: abandonment would not stand while humanity could act. Orders left the network with spare phrasing and absolute certainty. Logistics officers assembled relief columns, engineers compiled frameworks, medics configured fleets for triage and restoration. None asked who would repay the effort. The only question permitted was how fast help could arrive without risking the people already waiting. Across vessels and outposts, the same sentence repeated, steady, unadorned: they are not alone. The colony's receivers strained through storms of interference until a new voice crossed the void, deliberate and calm, promising presence rather than rescue, partnership rather than command. It did not bargain. It did not flatter. It simply affirmed that lives carried value independent of convenience. Within shelters and hangars, listeners felt the weight in their chests lighten, not because salvation had arrived, but because someone had finally chosen to hear. Humanity did not approach as arbiters of fate. They came as witnesses unwilling to look away, bearing the discipline of planners and the stubborn compassion of those who understand what it means to endure. The galaxy might measure strength in fleets and titles, yet the first proof of human power was simpler: a promise carried across darkness, declaring with quiet finality that a forgotten world would not face its trial unwitnessed or abandoned. Crews prepared to shoulder risk without spectacle, aware that intervention demanded patience, restraint, and endurance. They studied terrain, mapped safe corridors, gathered translators and teachers beside physicians and builders, knowing that survival would depend on restoring dignity as much as restoring power. Every directive centered the people requesting aid, their customs, their agency, their future right to stand unaided. Assistance would be a bridge, never a leash. In the archives of distant capitals, the decision read like an anomaly, a gesture without strategic dividend, yet among those preparing the journey the meaning required no translation. Where others had calculated, humanity responded, guided by a conviction older than treaties: leaving people to disappear in the margins diminishes everyone who accepts it. The launch schedules formed, cargo hatches sealed, and the message that began as a whisper became oath and identity, repeated across crews, stations, and watchposts with unwavering calm: we are with you. The colony could not yet see approaching vessels, but the knowledge that someone had chosen to stand beside them changed the tenor of every waiting hour. Repairs continued, hands steadier, voices firmer, not because fear vanished, but because isolation no longer defined their horizon. What the galaxy had dismissed as expendable now carried witness and solidarity, and in that recognition the first foundations of survival took hold, setting the course for everything that would follow when humanity finally arrived. Their promise moved ahead of every engine, steady still. The first confirmation of arrival came as a steady declaration, measured and direct, carrying none of the grandiosity that distant powers used when announcing control. It stated presence as commitment, promising labor, patience, and continuity, and its tone revealed a certainty that did not require threats or applause. Supplies were organized according to need rather than image, and every action emphasized responsibility over spectacle. Humanity did not present itself as deliverer or judge. It spoke as a partner prepared to shoulder weight for as long as endurance and discipline could sustain it. The words that followed explained objectives with clarity: restore stability, safeguard lives, transfer knowledge, and leave behind a future that belonged to the people of the recovering world rather than to those assisting them. Each promise was shaped with caution, aware that trust could not be demanded or purchased, only proven through consistency. The response from the colony carried disbelief at first, then cautious recognition that the pledge was genuine. Questions rose about cost, authority, and expectation, and every answer returned to the same principle: cooperation, not dependence. Humanity described shared frameworks for governance during Reconstruction, transparent distribution of resources, and training programs designed to eliminate the need for external oversight as soon as feasible. Observers across the galaxy listened and waited for the inevitable clause that converted aid into leverage. It never came. The Declaration emphasized sovereignty, dignity, and the right of a community to define itself once the crisis no longer threatened its survival. That refusal to extract advantage unsettled rivals more than fleets or weapons ever could. Behind every statement lay structure. Schedules were designed to minimize disruption, specialists rotated to prevent burnout, and cultural advisors worked to ensure that assistance strengthened identity rather than replacing it. Communications remained open, respectful, and precise, avoiding sentimentality while acknowledging the emotional weight carried by those who had endured abandonment. Humanity's representatives insisted that gratitude was not a requirement, only collaboration and mutual honesty. The promise, "We are with you," did not function as slogan, it functioned as operational doctrine, guiding decisions from logistics to ethics. The recovering world learned that the phrase meant readiness to withstand criticism, endure uncertainty, and accept the burden of mistakes while correcting them openly. Across distant councils, arguments erupted over motives and precedent. Some claimed hidden expansion, others predicted collapse under the expense of sustained support. Yet the longer the project continued, the clearer its design became. Humanity demonstrated that strength could manifest through reliability, that discipline could replace coercion, and that moral resolve could shape outcomes without spectacle. The colony, once relegated to the margins of strategic charts, became a living proof that neglect was not an inevitability of politics but a choice that could be rejected. Confidence grew not from dependence on outside guardians, but from the realization that an ally willing to stand without ownership also expected resilience in return. As restoration advanced, people who had once whispered into failing transmitters began planning for generations rather than days. They were asked to lead, to decide, to challenge proposals when necessary. Humanity welcomed disagreement, treating it as a sign that autonomy was taking root again. The work remained demanding and often exhausting, yet every setback was addressed with the same calm certainty that had accompanied the first pledge. No triumphal announcements marked progress. Stability itself became the achievement. The declaration that began as a distant voice transformed into a shared understanding. Solidarity could be quiet, uncompromising, and enduring. Where the galaxy had turned away, another path had been chosen, and its meaning would echo long after the final systems were restored. Coordination defined the next phase, and every contribution followed a deliberate rhythm that placed endurance above urgency. Teams integrated expertise without hierarchy, aligning objectives so that rebuilding emerged from cooperation instead of command. Builders focused on stabilizing foundations that allowed local workers to reclaim ownership of their infrastructure, while analysts translated complex data into practical guidance the community could apply long after outside support departed. The emphasis remained on capability, not dependence, and every policy reflected that principle. Education advanced alongside construction. Mentors paired with apprentices drawn from every district, teaching maintenance, diagnostics, and planning through repetition rather than lecture. Manuals were written in local dialects, annotated with observations gathered from workers themselves, turning knowledge into a living record instead of an instruction set fixed by outsiders. Progress moved slowly on purpose, because durability required comprehension, and comprehension demanded time. Humanity's defensive commitment operated with the same restraint. Patrols maintained distance from civilian zones, visible enough to assure safety yet careful not to overshadow the authority of local stewards. Conflict simulations were shared transparently, and joint drills trained residents to manage threats without permanent reliance on foreign guardians. The message underlying every exercise was consistent: protection was temporary, responsibility was permanent. Engineers collaborated with ecologists to restore water tables and soil integrity while preserving indigenous cultivation methods. Where technology could accelerate recovery, it was introduced as a bridge, always accompanied by training and open schematics. The recovering population began adapting tools to their own needs, redesigning systems in ways that reflected culture and environment. Observers abroad interpreted this autonomy as strategic risk. To those involved, it was the clearest measure of success. Communication ethics formed another pillar. Information about progress, failures, and uncertainties flowed in both directions, inviting critique rather than defending pride. Humanity's representatives refused to obscure setbacks, treating accuracy as a form of respect. The colony reciprocated, challenging proposals when they conflicted with lived experience, and those disagreements strengthened outcomes instead of fracturing cooperation. As capacity expanded, leadership transitioned toward local councils that had once been silenced by crisis. They assumed budgeting authority, selected project priorities, and evaluated performance metrics that measured resilience instead of dependency. Humanity stepped back without vanishing, remaining present as support rather than direction. The shift signaled that the promise made at the beginning had matured into trust that did not require constant reassurance. The wider galaxy watched the transformation with unease, struggling to reconcile quiet competence with influence that did not advertise itself. Analysts searched for hidden leverage and found instead a framework any world could adapt: partnership grounded in preparation, accountability, and patience. The recovering society now addressed visiting delegations with confidence, not as clients of distant benefactors but as peers capable of collaboration on their own terms. Stability no longer resembled survival, it resembled possibility. What endured from this stage was neither dependence on outside guardians nor gratitude shaped by obligation, but a disciplined understanding that resilience had been rebuilt through shared effort. Humanity's role became easiest to define in its absence. Systems functioned, institutions made decisions, and the community looked outward with the confidence to offer assistance elsewhere when called upon. The example traveled farther than any broadcast, altering conversations in places that had once dismissed marginal worlds as expendable. It demonstrated that competence could coexist with humility, that strength expressed through reliability could change outcomes more deeply than intimidation, and that the statement delivered at the outset, affirming presence without possession, had evolved into a relationship sustained by respect. The work of this period did not seek admiration, it sought permanence, and in the steady continuation of daily life, that permanence quietly took hold. From that point forward, improvement no longer depended on outside momentum, it flowed from people who recognized their own capacity, preserved the lessons they had learned, and treated solidarity not as debt but as a standard they intended to extend to others in every future undertaking ahead. Recognition did not arrive as applause. It emerged through quiet calculations made by governments that had once treated distant populations as entries on a ledger. They monitored outcomes and traced every variable, expecting dependency to replace distress. Instead, projections shifted. Productivity rose without tribute, civic institutions stabilized, and the recovering world negotiated with assurance. The question no longer concerned whether it would survive but what standard others would now be measured against. Analysts recognized that the force shaping the region was neither intimidation nor spectacle. It was the credibility of commitments kept even when no one demanded them. Diplomats from rival blocs approached cautiously, searching for conditions hidden between lines of policy. None appeared. Meetings unfolded on equal terms, and the hosts outlined agreements that prioritized continuity over concession. Observers confronted an unfamiliar reality. The partner they had dismissed now spoke with authority earned through competence rather than leverage. The shift unsettled doctrines built on exchange of favors. Here, credibility derived from reliability, and reliability generated influence without demand. Debate intensified within councils that had refused to intervene. Some argued that the precedent threatened established hierarchies. Others observed that the demonstration had exposed a deeper weakness: indifference corrodes order faster than risk. Reports described communities once resigned to neglect now reassessing their own expectations, asking why abandonment should remain acceptable when another path had proven viable. The discussion spread from executive chambers to trade guilds and academic forums, reshaping language around responsibility. The world at the center of this change declined to claim moral triumph. Its representatives described progress as a collaboration rooted in diligence and shared patience. They emphasized autonomy while acknowledging the support that had safeguarded their transition. That balance impressed visiting delegations, who found no theatrics to dismiss. What they encountered was a populace prepared to negotiate on merit, confident not because others feared its defenders but because its institutions functioned. A regional crisis soon tested these assumptions. Shipping routes faltered after a neighboring sector suffered catastrophic outages, and multiple factions maneuvered to control the corridor. Where earlier eras would have produced brinkmanship, negotiations proceeded differently. The revitalized world proposed a cooperative framework grounded in transparency and shared risk management. Humanity endorsed the approach without overshadowing local leadership, offering technical validation and limited safeguards that respected jurisdiction. The plan stabilized trade and prevented escalation, not through coercion but through confidence in systems capable of absorbing strain. Observers who had predicted dependency were forced to acknowledge a different outcome. Influence radiated from competence applied consistently, and that influence reframed expectations across entire networks. Requests for guidance arrived from places once wary of outside involvement, not seeking partnership modeled on accountability. Humanity's role remained deliberate and finite, yet the assurance that it would stand firm while others strengthened themselves became a stabilizing factor in regional policy. The conclusion many finally reached was neither sentimental nor ideological. It recognized that neglect imposes costs that compound quietly until they eclipse any savings imagined by inaction. The example before them demonstrated that steadfast cooperation, disciplined planning, and respect for sovereignty could transform outcomes without subjugation. In that realization, the balance of influence across the region shifted toward those prepared to accept responsibility, and the statement once spoken as reassurance took on wider significance, a commitment to stand beside others until they could stand securely on their own. The result altered diplomatic practice, encouraging coalitions built on verifiable responsibility rather than rhetoric. Worlds previously resigned to marginal status began charting plans that assumed participation in shared resilience initiatives, confident that partnership could coexist with independence. For many leaders, this shift marked a turning point, proving that stability grows when promises are honored without expectation of control. The understanding spread through trade networks, civic institutions, and research alliances, reinforcing a simple conclusion: reliability carries power, and when it is extended with humility, it reshapes the space between nations. In that space, cooperation. Years after the first signal was heard, continuity became the measure of success rather than recovery. Public records documented agreements, lessons, and procedures so future generations would understand why cooperation mattered and how it had been sustained. Memorial markers honored perseverance without dramatizing suffering, and archives preserved every pledge that had been kept. Humanity continued to visit as partner and student, sending observers who listened more than they spoke, refining their own institutions through what they learned from the world they had once helped stabilize. The relationship matured into an exchange of research, trade expertise, and emergency readiness practices, governed by charters that emphasized transparency and the right to withdraw without penalty. Influence endured because it could be questioned openly. The colony's schools integrated case studies describing the long reconstruction, focusing on decisions that protected agency. Students analyzed failures alongside achievements and treated self-critique as civic responsibility. Delegations from distant systems attended these seminars, discovering that resilience was not framed as miracle or charity but as disciplined collaboration. Humanity presented its contributions as one thread within a broader fabric, acknowledging that strength grows when ownership remains local. This approach encouraged other societies to design similar partnerships, scaling aid to capacity and insisting that autonomy expand as competence returned. With time, the revitalized world began offering assistance beyond its borders. Its engineers supported disaster mitigation projects in regions facing environmental stress, while its planners helped smaller settlements build data registries that ensured continuity during crises. Humanity assisted when invited, yet followed the colony's lead, recognizing that credibility deepens when those who once received support become capable of extending it. Trust no longer depended on promises. It was demonstrated through shared action across cultures and distances. Economic networks adjusted to reflect this ethic. Contracts prioritized resilience metrics, suppliers diversified transportation corridors, and insurance cooperatives rewarded preparation rather than excessive risk. Decision-makers cited the earlier abandonment as a warning about the cost of indifference, and the successful recovery as proof that foresight could be institutionalized. While rival powers debated symbolism, trade guilds and civic councils implemented practical reforms that favored accountability, because they had witnessed a model that worked. Humanity's internal dialogue also evolved. Reports returned to Earth describing how humility had strengthened outcomes, and academies incorporated those findings into training for diplomats, engineers, and relief coordinators. The phrase "we are with you" acquired new nuance, meaning patience, clarity of purpose, and willingness to accept limits when partnership required restraint. By treating solidarity as obligation to do the work well rather than to dominate, humanity reshaped its identity in the eyes of both allies and critics. The colony marked the anniversary of its renewal with a gathering open to all communities that had contributed to its stability. There were no broadcasts promising destiny, only statements of gratitude for the discipline that had protected choice. Representatives affirmed that their sovereignty endured because cooperation had respected it at every stage. Humanity's delegation repeated a simple assurance: they would remain reachable, not as guardians, but as equals willing to stand alongside others whenever resolve and preparation could make a difference. What endured from those years was not myth or spectacle, but a culture of responsibility that crossed borders without erasing them. Worlds that had once assumed isolation as fate began to plan with one another, confident that partnership could coexist with independence. The region's stability rested on habits formed through steady, quiet commitments, proving that influence grounded in reliability can outlast empires built on fear. And as new challenges rose across the stars, the promise carried forward, unchanged in essence and strengthened by history. When lives are at risk and the choice between neglect and courage appears again, humanity will answer by standing with others until they can stand with confidence themselves. In that enduring ethic, cooperation becomes heritage, guiding distant futures towards steadier horizons shaped by shared resolve and practical compassion for every world.